I call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to rise in this, the first part of the Parental Leave and Employment Protection 6 months paid leave and work contact hours amendment bill. It will be a relief, Mr Chair, when we do eventually get on to clause 1 and we can talk about a different title, a slightly shorter one for this bill. But the main points we will have traversed in this part 1 have been around cost. And so I'd like to just raise a few items. One, the costs that the sponsoring member raised, and then some consideration of cost and affordability that a previous opposition speaker, Ms Ardern, raised. So Ms Moroney, when she was having her first call on this bill, pointed out that in the first year that the cost impact of Part 1 would be, I think it was $10 million, she said. Well, that's not quite right and very wrong, not quite right for one reason and very, very wrong for another. So the reason it is not quite right is the most latest edition of figures from MB actually said about 12 million through until the end of the current financial year, so until the end of June this year. Now, the reason for that, Mr Chair, which is relevant to the cost consideration, as Ms Moroney put it, is that officials, of course, had to give advice on the bill as it was introduced to Select Committee and not on the amendments or the recommendations that we finally arrived at. So originally what was going to happen was the first increase in weeks of paid parental leave were going to take place in the past. They were going to take place a couple of months ago and this year. So of course they made some estimates based on the remainder of the current financial year before then projecting, forecasting costs into the future. Now, the bill, as has been reported back to the House and which is under consideration in this, the Committee of the Whole, has actually shifted the start date from 2016 now to full year to April 2017. Now, what will happen in that year, of course, is when it does come into force in the 1st of April 2017, should it pass...
Order. That's in the commencement. We're on Part 1.
Part 1, Mr Chair.
So when you get you'll get a chance to talk about the preliminary clauses later on, which is extending it comes into force on the 1st of April 2017. But just asks you to focus on Part 1. Brent Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So the implication of Part 1 of moving to 22 weeks will see an increase in cost of about $12 million from the 1st of April 2017 through until the end of June 2017. From that point on, Mr Speaker, each year at 22 weeks, doing a rough mental calculation, because MB rated the total cost across 5 years plus the few start months of the full bill to be $466 million, then very roughly, if it was only at 22 weeks, which of course all that Part 1 does, we're fundamentally half. It's roughly going to be in the order of around $230 million additional over that period of time. Now, the government's point has always been, and doesn't seem to be grasped by the submitters at the Select Committee, but the government's point has always been that it's not one additional dollar of paid parental leave that is necessarily the problem, but the total cost. Now, in the course of both the consideration of this particular bill as drawn, but previous iterations of bills in a similar vein, the government has taken steps. The government has taken steps to increase paid parental leave. It has increased it from 14 to 18 weeks.
Point of order.
The member appears to be straying into other pieces of legislation, not Part 1 of this bill.
I'm listening very closely. In fact, I have Part 1 in my hand, and if the member strays, being able to refer back is okay, so long as one doesn't dwell on it. And I'm listening very carefully. I have it in front of me, and I'll ask the member to concentrate on Part 1.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And exactly the point being is that the government's position has been it's the complete cost of a change that is the issue. And the government has made the affordable steps already. And so in the most recent budget, of course, where the government has not made a further extension, what that shows is within the current fiscal envelope, there is not the headroom right now to increase further. that a government has many responsibilities above and beyond simply paid parental leave. We've got schools infrastructure, we've got additional money for healthcare, we've got issues that government expends money on, which means, Mr Chair, that if we're expending money in certain areas, that money is not available to be expended today or in this coming year on an extension to paid parental leave. So the position still remains, and it's very clearly evidenced by that current fiscal position for the coming financial year, that a move to 22 weeks is not affordable. Now, another member opposite Mr Chair, Ms Ardern, made a point about large surpluses. Now, they're actually a future consideration. They're not relevant to Part 1, but she did get to talk to them, so I just want to cover them. Her point was simply this, Mr Chair, that if the answer to a question in the House today, we can talk about spending a sizable amount of money on defence, then we could spend that amount of money on paid parental leave. The point being that those large surpluses will not come into the forecast of those large surpluses will not, Mr Chair, will not see them realised for growing in size in about another 2 financial years and then a further 2 beyond that. So that is well outside the scope of Part 1. And so what the member was trying to do is spend money we haven't yet earned on something that would cost us money in the next 12 months. Now, that's not exactly unusual for the opposition to do that. In fact, it's pretty much what they always campaign on. But what it isn't, sir, is evidence of money available today to put into force the effect of Part 1, which would be to add a further 4 weeks of paid parental leave. So, to claim that, that statements made in the budget or answers to question in the House today somehow evidence an affordability couldn't be further removed from the actual situation. It may be, and I'm not going to speculate on what our Minister of Finance would do in the position. It may be that with those surpluses in the future there could be a headroom to change, but it's not in this coming next financial year. Mr Chair, I just want to mention, and I won't dwell upon this, but I just want to mention another reason for the overall picture that we take, which has an impact on our position for Part 1 and why we oppose it, is that care and support for families with young children, with newborns, can take a number of different forms. So this bill would propose simply extending additional weeks of paid leave. But what the government has done and still looks at doing further is actually broadening the eligibility for the level of paid parental leave that exists today. So we look at seasonal workers, employees with more than one employer. We look at different family caring arrangements like whāngai parents or grandparents caring for children. Family and care arrangements which are relevant and meaningful for the parents, but which to date or previously would not have been eligible under a paid parental leave scheme. So the government is expending finances to deliver those services and to broaden the eligibility, but the dollar spent in doing that is, in effect, a dollar that isn't therefore spent on Part 1 on an additional 4 weeks. We actually have to consider, when we look at this and say, are we prepared to make this extension, it is important that we look at the additional expenditure in the area of paid parental leave, not just in the number of weeks, but in the different eligibility broadening. It's important we look at the total cost rather than just look at very simplistic as how many weeks, what is the total number of weeks. And I think very clearly, Mr Chair, this government has expended a great deal extra, as I've said, in moving it to 18 weeks from 14, but also broadening the eligibility. So we take the position that we show care and support for young families. We are putting the things in place to help them give the best start. In fact, a broader section of the community than this bill would give, because this bill's only, hasn't got anything to do with other care arrangements or anything to do with employment arrangements. It's simply about a number of weeks. If it hadn't been for the measures the government's looking to put in place, this bill wouldn't apply to those people. It would actually leave them out in the cold, so to speak. So we take the view that there are a couple of ways you can address the whole issue of caring for young families. You can simply take a simplistic approach of increasing the number of weeks, or you can do it via other means. And we have been doing that through our balance of both, increasing the number of weeks of support, but also broadening the eligibility. And on the whole, Mr Chair, our view is that that gives a far better outcome across a broader group and is affordable in our current fiscal conditions, whereas to move to accept Part 1, as it stands, would simply be to put in place something that isn't affordable in the coming year or in the coming couple of years, given the projected surpluses. And even if we were to consider further on out that in our forecast surpluses, I would caution the House that a government has more responsibilities than simply the services or the cost under this bill. And so when we do look out at larger surpluses into the future, we have to think about the other pressing needs across society around the services and the infrastructure that a government is duly responsible to deliver, and make sensible and pragmatic decisions relevant to all of those factors. So right at the moment, our position remains that to support Part 1, to increase paid parental leave by this amount so soon, is unaffordable, and it is something that we cannot support, Mr Chair, and we will not be.
Mr Chair.
I call